to our webinar on screening candidates. My goal today is for you to gain some tools to be able to put to immediate use at the end of our time together. So just a quick review of our learning objectives today. One, to understand why screening is important in the hiring process. Now, most folks I chat with are pretty motivated to screen more effectively, pardon me, when they realize how much it's costing their organization. Also, to understand the legal considerations, the rater biases, and the online screening cautions to help prevent you from making a costly mistake. And that'll be our foundation that we start with today. Pardon me. Also, learn what inputs can be drawn from when preparing to hire and the valuable information that they can provide, as well as understand, of course, how to develop and use your rating guide and your rating grid for selecting the best applicants to interview. Now, that'll be the real meat of our session today, and that'll take place in Mod 3. So using a selection guide and selection grid will give you a solid leg to stand on for defending your selection decisions, and it'll give you confidence in your hiring decision. So our breakdown for about the next 60 minutes looks like this. In Module 1, we'll review some important considerations in the selection process, including the impact of cost. This section is a review of the information that you should be aware of before you start your hiring process. And it's the foundational information that you and your hiring team ought to understand prior to building your selection criteria. In Module 2, we'll break down the hiring inputs, what they are, and the information that you need from them to develop your rating guide and your rating grid. And in Module 3, we'll walk through the process of developing a rating guide and your rating grid so that you'll be able to use your handouts that you'll receive after today's webinar to develop your own effective tools. Now, in the end of each module, we'll also have a couple of minutes for questions and answers. And like Marina said, there will be a few short poll questions along the way. So without further ado, let's jump in. And we're starting with our first polling question. So please just click the response that best describes the recruitment process at your organization. So our question is, my organization's recruitment process is A, conducted with little to no planning, B, follows an unwritten process, C, follows a written procedure that's reviewed and revised regularly, or D, I'm not sure. So just take a minute to select where your organization's recruitment process is at. And how are we doing with that, Marina?
Well, Kathleen, it looks like we're at an even split between follows an unwritten process and follows a written process that is updated regularly.
Hey, that's pretty good. Okay, well, for those of you that do have somewhat of a process, but it's not documented, one of the things that I'd like for you to walk away with today is the importance of documentation. Now, while it may simply seem like a lot of extra work for you, it can pay off big time if your selection ever gets questioned. And following a well-documented procedure that demonstrates consistency in the process and allows you and your organization to demonstrate that a hire was selected based on bona fide occupational requirements. So like I said earlier, it really does give you the confidence in your decision. Now, as I said earlier, Mod 1 covers understanding pardon me, the impact of your hiring process. In this section, we're going to cover not just the cost of the hiring process, but also the cost of a bad hire, the role of the Human Rights Act in the hiring process, a few of the rater biases, and how they can unknowingly influence your hiring decision, and then also what you need to know about online screening of applicants. Now, before we jump into the cost of a bad hire, I'd first like to know what you think is the average cost of hiring a new employee for an entry-level role. So again, please just select your response from the ones given here. What do you think is the average cost of hiring a new employee for an entry-level role? Is it less than $2,000? Is it $2,000 to $5,000? Is it $5,000 to $10,000? Or is it more than $10,000?
Well, we've got some furious voting action happening here, Kathleen. But it looks like 54% are looking at option number 2, 2,000 to 5,000.
Okay. All right. Well, based on the average wage of the person that's hiring for the role, and that was a bit of a trick question, regardless of the role you're hiring for, it's usually based on the average wage of the person hiring for the role times the number of hours spent for the description review, the documentation revision and review, all your preparation and your advertising, all of the things that go into the process. The average bottom line impact for hiring a new employee can be over $20,000. Now, this particular number on the screen was based on an average annual salary of the raters being $30,000. So as you can see, the number can add up pretty quickly, and the hiring process isn't cheap. Needless to say, we all want to make sure that we've made the best selection possible the first time around. Now, the cost of hiring a new employee is expensive, so we always want to consider the cost of a bad hire as well, which can more than quadruple the cost of a new hire. With a bad hire or a bad fit, we may also see an increase in other costs, such as employee turnover, lost work days, inefficiency, lost customers or potentially funders, and an increase in accidents or incidents in the workplace. Now, when there's a bad fit, whether it be in the ability to do the job or communicate well with others, fit into the team or relate well to the internal and external customers, the overall cost of a hire can turn into an extremely costly venture. And really, following a sound process will help decrease the likelihood of this. So there are some steps that you can take to reduce the bad costs and improve the likelihood of making a great decision. Some of the things to be aware of before you start are the legal considerations, rater biases, the purpose of sound selection criteria, and of course documentation. Now this is your foundation. Now let's start with taking a look at what's legal. Informing everyone on your hiring team about the information in this section will help you remove limitations or errors from your hiring process. And making sure that your selection criteria is legal is an important first step. So except where there's a genuine occupational requirement, it's considered discriminatory and in contravention with the Human Rights Act for any of the following to influence your hiring or selection decisions. That includes race, age, color, physical or mental disability, ancestry, sex, political beliefs, religion, marital status, and criminal conviction that's unrelated to employment. So it's important that you ensure that your hiring criteria doesn't include any of these items, from your shortlisting criteria to your interview questions to your reference checking. Ensure that you're avoiding the prohibited grounds of discrimination. Pardon me. Now just a note here that the prohibited grounds of discrimination are slightly different for each province. So a piece of homework for all of you today is for you to research how the prohibited grounds of discrimination apply to your region. And that really is as simple as a Google search. It's available online at your fingertips. Now, while we're not talking about the interview process today, I felt it was still important to cover biases because they can sometimes leak into the shortlisting process. And of course, it's an important part of preparing your hiring team. Having a process and documentation in place will help reduce rater biases automatically. Now, many of us like to think that we're not biased. However, most of us do have some level of bias, and often it's unrecognized. Biases limit our perspective, and they can negatively influence our selection decisions. A bias is kind of like a filter that skews the way we view something, whether it be in a positive or a negative light. That filter prevents us from seeing the picture clearly. So this is one of the reasons it's good to have a sound selection process in place and well-informed panel for the interview process. Now just a quick run-through of the biases that we have here. Stereotyping, this is, I'm sure most of us are familiar with it. That's when we form a generalized opinion about how people of a certain gender, religion, or race appear, think, act, feel, or respond. Inconsistency in questioning. Well, consistency in questioning for every potential candidate is important in your hiring process. because without equal and consistent information, you're skewing the playing field. If you allow more information from one candidate than you do from another, the playing field's not even, and the results that you're weighing in the end to make your decision aren't accurate. So this speaks loudly again to the importance of a well-documented process. First impression error, this is exactly as it sounds. Maybe the first impression of someone's voice or the way they dress or even the writing style on their resume reminds you of something else, something from the past, bringing to the forefront a positive or negative filter for viewing the rest of the candidate's qualifications. First impressions do form a solid opinion, and they can decrease our ability to see the other positive or negative qualities of the person that we're shortlisting or interviewing. Negative emphasis, well, this is where unfavorable information tends to be more influential and memorable than favorable information. So those in the selection or hiring position should avoid focusing on the negative information to the exclusion of the positive. Halo and horn effect, this is when we're allowing ratings of performance in one competency to influence the ratings of other competencies. For example, allowing high ratings in oral communication to bias the rating on problem solving, irrespective of the candidate's performance in problem solving. And same, of course, for negative rating, hence halo all good or horn all bad rating. Cultural noise. This is the failure to recognize a response of a candidate that are socially acceptable rather than factual. And this is when a candidate responds to questions with answers that are deemed to be politically correct. And during your interview process, the way you question and your follow-up questions can really help you get beyond cultural noise. Also nonverbal, I'm sure you're all familiar with this as well. It's where undue emphasis is placed on nonverbal cues that are unrelated to the job performance, such as hair length or a distracting mannerism. And it can also apply to the resume screening as well, say the layout of the resume or the words or language that are used there. And contrast, this compares one candidate against the other instead of comparing everyone to an objective standard. So for example, if the first candidate was dressed better than the second candidate, or one candidate made more eye contact than the other, you're comparing them to one another instead of everyone to the same objective criteria. Then of course there's the similar to me, and this refers to picking a candidate based on personal characteristics that they share with the interviewer or the selector, and items that aren't related to the job. So the important factor to recognize with bias is to check ourselves before shortlisting or before going into an interview and leave our biases at the door so that we can hire the candidate that's best suited for the job and not someone who's just like us. Train your managers and supervisors on the dangers of biases as well and how to recognize them before they impact the outcome of the hiring process. And again, like I've said, having guidelines and processes, your rating grids in place, will limit the impact of rater bias. Well, here's one thing that has received much interest over the last few years, and that's social media screening. And while it's been a lure for a lot of people and attractive to those who feel it may be cutting-edge screening practices, there are some things that I'd like you to be aware of if you're thinking about doing this. So if you've been enticed to check out someone's Facebook page or review someone's tweets, are you opening yourself up to rater bias? And you probably are. Also, remember our privacy laws and think carefully about whether the information that you're collecting is reliable and relevant to the occupational job requirements. Put simply, would the information you garner from a social media site assist you in making a sound hiring decision based on bona fide occupational requirements? Would your inclusion of this information in your selection criteria stand up in court if your hiring decision were ever put to the test? Now, you may think that one exception to this would be LinkedIn, which is a social media site specifically designed for professional and work-related interactions. Now, reviewing a LinkedIn profile may give you more insight about an applicant on a professional level. However, I want to also mention again the importance of a consistent process for all the candidates, one that your documentation could support if your hiring decision's ever challenged. So if you're doing it with one, do it with another, document it all, and make sure it is based on actual job qualifications. Okay, well, we have come to the end of our first module of our base information. We have a couple of minutes for questions. Do we have any questions so far, Marina?
Yes, Kathleen, you've been talking quite a bit about legal implications with the hiring process, and we've had quite a few questions come up about that, one being on employment equity. So could you explain a little bit more about what employment equity is and how it might affect some of our participants today?
Okay, yeah, and that's a really good question. Thank you. The Act requires that employers remove barriers to employment that disadvantaged members of the 4 designated groups hold. So these 4 designated groups are women, people with disabilities, Aboriginal peoples, and visible minorities. So the Employment Equity Act, that's federal legislation, and it applies only to a very narrow group of industries that are federally regulated under the Canadian Constitution. So those include businesses like banks, broadcasters, telecommunication companies, railroads, airlines, private businesses that are necessary to the operation of the Federal Act, maritime transportation companies, and other transportation companies if they're interprovincial, and a few others. But overall, the federal employment equity legislation covers only about 6% of the Canadian workforce. So the scope of the Employment Equity Act is quite limited. And the vast majority of employers, including nearly all not-for-profit organizations, do fall outside of its jurisdiction. Now, while you likely don't fall under this Act, you may have an employment equity clause in your contract. Now, and this is when you would add that clause to your deal breaker section of your rating guide and rating grid. And we'll talk further about the deal breakers and what's on your rating guide and rating grid later. So I hope that answers your question. Do we have time for any other questions, Marina?
I think we'll move along at this point, but we'll have more time for questions as we go through the webinar. Thanks, Kathleen.
Okay, thank you. All right, moving into Mod 2. In Module 2, we're going to review a few of your hiring inputs that can contribute to your hiring criteria. They include the goals, values, and culture of your organizational plan, your contractual commitments, your job specifications, or your job description. And these inputs give you the information that you need to develop your hiring criteria. And this is used to develop your rating guide and your rating grid, as well as later on your interview questions and documentation and your reference check questions and documentation. These inputs will help you identify the knowledge, skills, and abilities or competencies that you want to see in the ideal candidate. They become your hiring criteria. Now, we have another poll question for you. What I'd like to know here is whether or not your organization is currently using rating grids for the selection process. So please just indicate again if your organization is using rating grids for the hiring process. Never, only to shortlist, only in the interview process, only for reference checks, or in each step of the hiring process.
All right, and again, we've got another split between never and only in the interview process.
Okay, well, that's an interesting split. And pardon me, there are several benefits to using your rating grids for your recruitment process. I've mentioned that it really does make every step of your hiring decision defensible if it's ever challenged. And developed effectively can improve the quality of hire. They also make the hiring process easier for everyone involved, and they reduce the likelihood that you've missed something important, an important piece of decision-making information along the way. So I hope you do find the rest of our information helpful and supportive of that today. Now let's take a closer look at the inputs that I introduced in our previous slide. Your organizational values, goals, and culture tell a lot about what type of skills may be needed now as well as in the future, and what type of person will fit well with your organization. Hiring a candidate that doesn't fit with your organizational values and culture is not only going to be difficult for the organization and your existing team, but it'll also be difficult for the person that you hire. Now, the fit for this will be able to be determined more through the interview process, where you can ask questions and share information regarding the organization's values and culture. But the organization, the organizational goals can be taken into consideration at the shortlisting point. So your organizational goals may be broader than the base of skills that are currently held by your staff members. So at this stage, you may want to add to your nice-to-have or assets on your list of criteria that you're looking for. Now, much like your organizational values, culture, and goals, your organizational plan may add to your list of desired qualifications for your shortlist or assist you with developing questions for your interview process. Your plan will take into account not just what you need in the moment, in the particular role that you have vacant, but will also give insight into what knowledge, skills, and abilities or competencies you require moving forward. So taking a look at your shortfalls for future or expanded roles will give you additional information to add to your nice-to-haves or assets here on your rating guide. Now, of course, it's important to note here, too, that you need to acknowledge your existing staff's additional knowledge, skills, and abilities beyond what they're using in their roles at this point, so that you really understand where your gaps are. Now, contractual requirements. Our existing contractual requirements are, of course, relevant in our recruitment process. So if your job descriptions are not up to date or don't reflect your current contractual obligations, now's the time to review to ensure that you're taking these into account. It's also a good time to consider what your future contracts may look like. Or will there be any changes or revisions to your current contracts? What will that look like for staffing considerations? Incorporate this information into your rating guide list as well to make sure that you have not just what's needed in the moment, but again, to ensure that you're set for the future. Break out your essential criteria and your desired criteria. And of course, your job descriptions. Now, your job descriptions truly are the base for managing so many of your staffing processes. And the ideal time to review and revise the job descriptions is when you have a new opening. Again, taking into account all the information from our last slides. You have the opportunity to ensure that your job descriptions truly reflect the required performance and behavior of your staff, and that they're a clear guide for expectations. Your updated job descriptions will guide you in your hiring process, your onboarding and training processes, and the performance management and succession planning for your organization. So take the time to keep your job description current and utilize the information from the job description to list the essential knowledge, skills, and abilities and desired knowledge, skills, and abilities for your rating guide. Now, as you can see, the information gathered from your organization's existing plans and documents add to your hiring criteria. Now, this hiring criteria is what you use to develop your rating guide and your rating grid for your selection purposes. And we'll be taking a look at those shortly and walking through creating your guide. Now, so far, I've talked about what to review to prepare for your recruitment process. Now we're going to start taking a look at what to prepare. There are several items that you're working up to preparing while you're reviewing all of your previous inputs. They're your rating guide, your long list, short list rating grid, your interview questions, your interview rating grids, your reference check questions, and your reference check rating guide or grid. And of course, your interview panel. Pardon me. What we will look at more closely today is simply the rating guide and the long list, short list rating grid that you'll use to determine the best candidate for your interviews. Now, before we start to develop the rating guide and rating grid, I'd like to just reiterate the importance of using rating grids and in your hiring process. Pardon me, I'm very sorry. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, your rating grids and guides will help increase your accuracy in the process. Your rating grids help eliminate bias, and with documentation, you have something defensible for your hiring decision if it's ever questioned. And of course, using well-developed rating grids improves your chance of getting a quality hire and reduces the costs of the hiring process in the long run by reducing the likelihood of a bad hire. So when you develop clear job-specific hiring criteria and document your process along the way, you're really clear about what you want, and this gets you much closer to your ideal candidate. Now, the rating guides that I've mentioned several times as we've reviewed the inputs is the information that you're going to use to develop your rating grid. So this tool helps you document your deal breakers, your essential criteria for the job, and the desired criteria for the job. Now, this is the first time I've mentioned the deal breakers in the presentation, well, I guess other than answering the question that we had from Mod 1. What a deal breaker is a deal breaker would be criteria that must be present. For example, if your applicant currently lives out of your area, say you have an applicant from across Canada, you need to know if the applicant's willing to move for the job. If the applicant's not willing to move, this would be a deal breaker. Or if the job requires the candidate to speak French and the applicant doesn't speak French, this again would be a deal breaker. So you don't want to waste your time going through the rest of the screening process if the applicant doesn't meet your deal breakers. So give thought to what your deal breakers are, and then include those in your pre-screen, which we'll talk about, a telephone pre-screen at the front end of your rating grid. Next on your rating grid will be your long list items. Now, these are the criteria that are minimum job requirements. Anything required by contract, base education or training for the job, base skills, your minimum knowledge, skills, and abilities or competencies for the job. And this will be listed on your rating guide and then added to the essential criteria section of your long list short list grid. Next on the grid is going to be your short list items or your desired criteria. And this will be listed on your rating guide, pardon me, and added to your long list short list grid for documenting your selection process as well. Now, the initial list of criteria that you develop for your rating guide gets transferred, as you can see, to your grid, where you'll be able to document all the information for each applicant and then determine from one source which candidates are qualified to be moved on to your interview process. And then for those of you, pardon me, attending the live webinar today, you will receive a sample copy of the rating guide and rating grid that you can customize for your own purposes later. Now the telephone pre-screen. This is another useful tool in the selection process, and it may not be required for all of your applicants, but you may, however, have some missing information on a resume that you want to clarify prior to your selection, or you may need to review your deal breakers. Either way, this step would take place prior to the shortlisting to save you time, and it needs to be documented as well. So a pre-screen for out-of-town applicants or applicants that may seem to have missed something on their resume, or if demand is high and the wages are low, you may want to pre-screen for commitment prior to shortlisting in order to save yourself time and money in the process. Now, your first contact with an applicant is always important. It sets a tone and it demonstrates your organization's behavior. So putting your best foot forward is important here. Ensure that you're prepared to share some information about your organization and your hiring process. Get to your questions and ensure that you are clearly understanding the response of the applicant. So repeat what you think that you've heard them say. Thank them for their time and let them know what the next steps will be. Now, if the candidate has not met your deal breakers, let them know. Just say, thank you for your time today. Seeing as how you're not willing to relocate and our job requires that you're in the office, we won't be able to move forward with your application. But if you're ever, ever ready to relocate, please apply with us again. Keep the door open. Be warm, welcoming, and honest. And then, of course, document the responses to your questions and make notes as to the next steps for the applicant. Now, this pretty full slide has a few additional tips for telephone screening that you may want to share with your hiring committee or panel. Now, if you're using predetermined questions, as I always recommend for all of your candidates, you should have no concerns here. However, I've included this slide just for those that may not use the formal format. So I'm not going to take your time reviewing these items one by one today. Rather, I'm going to leave it to you to review later on at your own pace once you get a copy of the slides. So again, it's for those really who are not going to, or who choose not to follow a documented process. And that wraps up Mod 2 for us. And I think we have a minute for questions. Do we have any questions, Marina?
We sure do, Kathleen. Thank you to everyone for submitting your questions today. We've got lots, and we're going to get through what we can. So here's one we've had from several people. How many people should an organization actually interview for a position?
Well, and that's a good question too. You don't want to waste too much time, but you want to make sure that you've got enough information. You have enough people to choose from. So a standard rule of thumb is anywhere from 3 to 6. Now, this, of course, is going to depend on the number of quality candidates that you have to draw from, too. So for those of you with a high number of potentials, you may want to set a higher rating number as a minimum for identifying candidates for interviewing, and that'll help shorten your interviewing numbers. And what I mean by that is probably going to come much more clear in our next section as we go through the rating grid and the points.
Excellent.
But yeah, 3 to 6. I hope that answers your question.
That's great. And just one more. Another participant has commented that they do have a clear hiring process at their organization, but they're having difficulty keeping people on after they're hired. And they're asking, why isn't the process working for them?
Oh, there's another good question. Well, and it may not be your process at all that's the problem. It could be your existing staff or the underlying culture that's contributing to your turnover. Now, in this case, if you're experiencing a lot of turnover, there are several things that I'd recommend you do to start with. And one, of course, is reviewing your hiring process thoroughly. Identify where your gaps may be, if you have any, where you might be able to improve it. Now, beyond that, also conducting exit interviews. Now, this may, depending on how you're doing it, it may not give you the information that you're looking for if it's conducted internally. So, because often someone exiting an organization is reluctant to openly share their experience for fear of retaliation. Everybody wants a good reference. So if you are going to conduct exit interviews, I do recommend that you use an external source for that. Another thing that you can do here is conduct engagement surveys on an ongoing basis with all of your staff. And this will garner useful information that will indicate an issue or give you the opportunity to drill down to the cause of what's really going on. So if it's not your hiring process, you're not getting information from the people that are leaving that's of value to you, engagement surveys may give you a little more information to draw from. So I hope that answers your question.
That's great. And Kathleen, before we continue on, we just have a couple of questions related to one of your previous slides about what is a KSA? Oh, I'm sorry. Knowledge, skills, and abilities. And I apologize for having that on the screen. I realize we don't have necessarily HR people here. So my apologies. Knowledge, skills, and abilities for the job. That's great. Thank you. You're welcome. So are we ready to move into Module 3 then? I think we are. Yeah, I think that would be great. Okay. So moving into Module 3, we will be reviewing the development of our rating guide and our rating grid. So we're going to review our pre-employment testing and go through a hiring checklist. Now, after the QA portion of this section, we're also going to have another poll question and then some wrap-up information from CharityVillage. So what we have here on this very busy slide is a condensed version of a rating guide.
Now, the rating guide will help anyone in your organization with the selection process. It outlines your deal breakers, the essential criteria, as well as the desired criteria for your selection process. And it consists of the information that you gathered from your hiring inputs. And it lists the criteria required and desired for the job. So just a quick note here, as what we have on the screen here is a condensed version, it doesn't include the section on deal breakers. I'm sorry, but it just didn't fit. For those of you attending the live session, though, you will find the full rating guide in your handout at the end of the session. And for those of you who will be developing this on your own, remember to put the deal breakers at the top of your rating guide. Now, this condensed sample here lists the area being rated on the left-hand side of the page. You can see that on the left. Then in the center column, it gives a breakdown for each of the areas being rated. And then the right-hand column lists the possible points for each criteria. So for our purposes today, this guide is color-coded to highlight the essential criteria in light orange, the desired criteria in dark orange, and then the total points possible each rating. Now, as the resumes start pouring in, a lot of people, how do I sort this stack? Or what if I miss the ideal candidate? Well, the answer to that is that your resume screening guide should list those things that you absolutely must have and still leave room for a little bit of flexibility. Now, I'd like to walk through this with you today, the process of filling it out. And this condensed rating guide that we have on the screen was developed for a receptionist who would be expected to do some typing as a part of the job responsibilities. So, of course, the organization wanted a resume as a form of application. So you see that at the top left. They awarded points for legibility and took away points for spelling or grammatical errors or neatness. So you see on the slide in light orange for essential criteria, 5 points for the resume, and an additional 5 points available for legibility for a maximum amount of points in blue in the application area being 10 points. Now, this organization had decided that grade 12 was a must, so it's identified this on the slide in light orange as well as essential criteria. Now, while grade 12 was a necessity, they felt there were opportunities attached to this position, so they wanted to see if the successful candidate had additional education or training. Now, in this case, they knew their marketing secretary was leaving at the end of the year to go back to school. So if the candidate in this role worked out well, they could possibly move on. So therefore, post-secondary education, such as community college, was worth 5 points and listed in dark orange on the slide to indicate desired criteria. Now, if the education was in a related field, administrative for example, they'd get another 5 points. Now, if the applicant had a degree, they would get another 5 points for a total of 15 of additional, totaling 20 available for this section. Now, it's important to note here, too, that the point system should clearly specify why a point would be taken away on any of the ratings. Now, moving on, since most of the critical part of the job was answering telephone lines, they were looking for somebody who had experience in multiple phone lines and could hit the ground running. Now, this was listed as essential criteria and worth 5 points. Now, they were also looking for somebody with experience since they didn't think that they had time to do a lot of training on the basics. So the candidate got 5 points for less than 3 years or an additional 5 points totaling 10 for more than 3 years. Also, this office is using Mac computers, and it's their experience that IBM-trained people never fully adjust to the Mac, so they were prepared to give 15 points to those who had experience on a Mac. Still listed it under desired, though not must-have, and then 5 points as a basic must-have to those who were IBM-trained. Now, next, the ability to do reports and spreadsheets were worth 5 points each for a total of 10. keyboarding skills were important too to this organization. They were going to test for accuracy, but they were looking for an indicated basic speed. So the candidate could get up to 15 points depending on their skill level. Now, when using a screening guide, you can decide on a pass mark, and I mentioned that earlier for sifting resumes. When you're using the guide, you can decide on a pass mark and then go through your resumes, or even have somebody else go through them at this point to shortlist your candidates. And some people ask at this stage, why bother with the long list shortlist if I have this rating guide? Well, the guide is just that. This is a guide that you're going to transfer to your easy-to-use long list shortlist rating grid. And that grid documents all of your applicants in one form for easy access and easy reference. The grid also enables you to delegate the task of selecting candidates once you've got your guide nailed down. Now, probably the most important feature of a rating guide in the following long list shortlist grid is that it's defensible. So it must be a test that everybody had to pass. So when people call in to see whether they were considered for the job or ask why they didn't get an interview, you have a defensible answer for them right in front of you. There's no guessing or humming and hawing. Now, your long list shortlist rating grid will include the items transferred from your guide, and then break the criteria down into your deal breakers, your essential criteria, and desired criteria. It will also include the name of the person rating the applicants, the title of the position being filled, and the date of review. And then also, of course, the name of each applicant that you're rating. This document will be a one-source guide for selecting candidates for your interview process. And this slide gives you a sample of the long list shortlist rating grid. And you'll note that the essential criteria and desired criteria from your rating guide have been transferred from that guide. But again, we have a condensed version here. It just doesn't, all of it just doesn't fit on the screen. So the deal breakers, again, would normally be listed to the left of your essential criteria on your full form. Now, across the top of this rating grid, what you have is your essential criteria in lighter blue, broken down into each rated area with a column that indicates if the candidate has met the essential criteria and if the candidate will be moved for further review. Then in the dark blue section, the list of desired criteria is broken down. Then in the gray, you have the total points received for desired criteria, a section for overall rating, and a section to indicate if the candidate will be moved forward to interview. Then down the left-hand side of your grid is where you list the name of each applicant. So as you see here, the rating grid allows you to track all applicants in one form, and it shows you at a glance which candidates have met your deal breakers, your essential criteria, and your desired criteria. So this grid will indicate who's best suited to be moved forward to the interview process. And now we have another poll question for you folks. What I'd like you to indicate here is whether or not your organization currently has a written procedure for your recruitment and selection process. Your responses are not at all. For some parts of the process, yes, but it's out of date, or yes, and it's updated regularly. So just choose the one that's best suited to you.
That's great. We've got lots of participation here, so thank you everyone for jumping in and voting on our poll. And Kathleen, it looks like we've got about 50% that are at for some parts of the process.
Okay. Okay, well, and I'm sure that at this stage of our webinar, you're likely recognizing how much easier your hiring process would be if you had a process in place that lays out each of these steps for you. You're not guessing once you have it in place. Now, another important part or aspect of your selection can be testing. Pre-employment testing can be helpful in the recruitment process, and with some types of testing, it may be required. The important thing to note with use of testing is that it ought to be objective and use standardized measures. So testing may be used for gauging an applicant's knowledge, skills, and abilities, or other characteristics that are specifically related to the job. And some of those include criminal records checks. Depending on who your clients are, who you're working with, you may need to do these prior to hiring. Also, reference checks. Now, this is listed under testing, but it really is an essential part of your hiring process before making a decision. Drug testing. For some organizations, drug testing is simply required for safety purposes. And of course, specific skills testing. We talked about how the organization in our sample was going to test for typing speed. Also, emotional intelligence testing and cognitive ability testing. And this often takes place more with your leadership roles. And of course, physical ability tests. Now, when determining whether or not to use a testing tool or which tools to use, keep in mind, is it reliable, valid, is it available through technology, is it legal, and of course consider the applicant response. And we'll just run through these real quick. Reliability refers to consistency. So it reflects the extent to which the individual score differences are due to true differences in the competency being assessed, and the extent to which they're due to chance or random errors. So a goal of good assessment is to minimize the random sources of error. As a general rule, the smaller amount of error, the higher the reliability. Validity refers to the relationship between performance on an assessment and performance on the job. So it's the most important issue really to consider when deciding whether to use a particular assessment tool, because an assessment that doesn't provide useful information about how an individual will perform on the job is really of no value to you at all. Also, technology. Now, the technology available is another factor in determining appropriate assessment tools. And for some agencies that receive a large volume of applicants for their positions, they may benefit from using technology to narrow down the applicant pool, such as online screening of resumes. A quick caution here with that, though, is that using technology for shortlisting has been the experience of myself and a lot of my colleagues that the criteria can be too tight and you can miss high potentials. So if you're choosing to go that route, test your system well to ensure that you're not losing out on good candidates. And a good way to test your system is to have your existing staff apply through that system. If your existing staff aren't getting moved on, then you know your parameters are too tight. Now, technology can also overcome distance challenges and enable you to reach a larger population of applicants. Say for interviewing, your candidate from across Canada who has applied has confirmed that yes, they're willing to move for the job, but you want to make it easier for both of you for the person to attend an interview. You can do that face-to-face over the computer. You can still observe their body language and get as much valuable information out of doing it through the computer screen as you would in person. Also, legal. Any assessment procedures used to make an employment decision must be shown to be job-related or valid. So, for example, you wouldn't test for physical ability if there are no physical requirements for the job. Remember our human rights points covered in the beginning of the webinar, right? Also, applicant response, and we often forget to take this into consideration. When applicants participate in the assessment process, or really our whole hiring process, they're not the only ones being evaluated. The agency is being evaluated as well. So applicants who complete an assessment process leave with an impression about the overall fairness of the assessment procedure. And their impressions can also be impacted by whether they believe they had the sufficient opportunity to display their job-related competencies. So the quality of the interactions between the applicant and the agency can also affect the applicant's reactions, not just your decisions. So anyone using a grueling process, assessment process, or hiring process may end up alienating applicants. So it's important to recognize that the applicant uses the whole hiring and assessment process as a means to gather information about the agency. So think about how an applicant may respond to your process or your testing. You don't want that to push a top candidate to look someplace else for an opportunity. Now, once you have your procedures and your documentation laid out, it's time to prepare your panel for the hiring process. Now, while the panel may not be a part of every step of your hiring process, for those of you that have one, it's still good practice to brief them on all of the expectations of their role, the rater biases, how to use the tools that you have in place, planning the interview process, who will ask what and when, and then how to ask an appropriate follow-up question. Give your panel ample time to review the resumes of the candidates as well as the questions for the interviews. Set your team up for success. By setting them up for success, you're setting up your candidates for success as well. Now, as we're winding down on today's webinar, I'd like to just review some of the key points for your hiring process. Firstly, know your purpose. After reviewing all of your inputs that we covered in Mod 2, you'll have a pretty clear purpose of your hiring initiative for both your present and your future needs. It'll be clear. Also, know your legal considerations. We reviewed that in Mod 1, and it's an important item to review with your hiring committee or panel. Prepare your documentation. Prepare everything in advance. It'll help make your hiring process seamless once it starts. Now, part of your planning process, of course, is setting timelines. We didn't talk about that in the session, but it's a key element. Set deadlines for accepting applications, shortlisting, interviewing, and selection. This saves time and it keeps everyone on point. Also, I've mentioned prepare your panel. Share all of the information with your panel in advance, and remember to set a comfortable atmosphere when you're interacting with the candidate, whether it be over the telephone in your pre-screen or during the interview. Put the candidate at ease. Remember that he or she is nervous, and when someone's nervous or feeling stressed, they may often forget an important point or they may miscommunicate. So put the candidate at ease. It'll help you gather the best information from them. Check their references and document your reference check process. Now, when you've decided to make an offer too, this is important. Have a backup plan. Your first choice may not accept the role, so give a timeline for that candidate to make the decision as to whether or not they want a job, and be prepared to move on to your second choice. Don't notify your unsuccessful candidates until you've secured your new hire. And, of course, document, document, document. And I think we have time for some questions.
Wonderful, and the questions are coming through fast and furious. So here's a popular one for you, Kathleen. What if no one meets the criteria that's set out by the organization in the rating guide?
Okay. Well, if unqualified applicants are applying, there are probably a couple of things that you may want to look at. One would be your recruitment sourcing. It may need to be reviewed, and what I mean by this is how and where you advertised or marketed your opening may be the issue. So it's important to target the competencies you want and need in your advertising, as well as advertising in the area that targets the type of applicant that you're looking for. So if you know you really advertised it well, your ad was well put together, it very clearly specified what you were looking for, what the ideal candidate would have, then it may be looking at where you put that ad out. What I mean by this, or an example would be CharityVillage, who's sponsoring our webinar today, is an ideal venue to market an opening for a job in the not-for-profit sector. But advertising a not-for-profit job in an oil and gas site would definitely not be targeting your market. So that gives a pretty extreme example of what I mean by that. The other thing that you could look at is the role that you're looking to fill in high demand? So in this case, it's important to review your hiring criteria, and you may need to revise it to find a candidate or candidates that would be suitable to the organizational fit, but trainable to the job. If there are a lot of jobs available and that position's in high demand, you may need to be more flexible. So with some roles in our shrinking candidate pool, many high demand roles require some flexibility in your hiring criteria. I hope that answers your question.
That's great. Especially in this last module, we've talked a lot about the need for documentation. How long would you suggest an organization keep this documentation on file after the hiring process is finished?
Okay, that's a good question. And yeah, I do recommend you keep it on file for a while. A standard time period for this would be about a year following your selection decision. So following the acceptance of the role, about a year. Just a note on this too. Remember to store this document or all of these documents in a safe place, as they do contain personal information. And when it comes time to dispose of them, I recommend shredding as the method for that. And there are a couple of reasons. Some of you may be asking now, what would be the purpose of keeping documentation? One would be to review your process. It's always good to keep this stuff on hand for a while so you can thoroughly review it and make sure you don't have any gaps. Another is you may lose this person for an unforeseen reason. You can go back and you can review again for potentials, or of course, if your hiring decision's ever questioned, you have everything there to support it. So I hope that answers your question. Standard's about a year.
Excellent. We did have one other question that popped up for a few people, Kathleen, and I'm hoping we just have a couple of minutes here. But a lot of our participants mentioned that they might easily get more than 100 resumes in for a job posting. Would you suggest doing the full rating guide that you've gone through the process for each one of those 100?
Well, you know, and that can be just such a daunting task. What I would do for the organizations that are receiving so many applicants is look for the deal breakers first. That will eliminate a lot of your applicants right there, and it'll save you time by not continuing with the rest of the screening and scoring process. So go for the deal breakers first if you're getting a ton of applicants in. That way you can quickly sift through them a little more quickly and just move on the ones that do have the deal breakers and you want to weigh more carefully. And I hope that helps. It usually does when we're doing it.
That's fantastic. That's great. Thank you, Kathleen.
Okay. So is that the end of our questions for right now then, Marina?
Yeah, we're just coming up on time, so I think we'll have to hold it there.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for your questions. And please remember, for anything that we didn't have time for during our question period today, a document covering your questions will go out shortly after the webinar. And before we wrap up, I have one more poll question for you. So what I'd like here is to get a little bit of feedback from you about today's session. As I mentioned in the beginning, it was my goal to give you information that you could put to immediate use. So do you feel that you've been provided with information that you can use right away? And your selection is strongly agree, agree, disagree slightly, disagree moderately, or strongly agree. Now, please remember too after this that if you have additional comments or questions, you can feel free to contact me directly as well, and my contact information is on the last slide. So have we pretty much wrapped up with this poll then, Marina?
Yes, we have. That's great. Thank you, everyone, for voting there. And do keep in mind also we'll be sending out a very short survey where you can provide more feedback when we send out the recording and the slides.
Okay. I'd just like to take a second here to thank you all very much for participating today and wish you all the best in your recruitment efforts. Thank you.
And thank you, Kathleen. A very informative session today, fully packed with lots of fantastic information. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to all of our participants for joining us today as well. It's been really wonderful to have you all here with us. Before you sign off, I just wanted to remind you that we will be sending out information in the next few days about how to access the recording and the slides, as well as for the live participants, the downloadable tools that Kathleen mentioned. And as I mentioned before, there will be a short survey as well where you can provide a little bit more feedback. And also watch for that question and answer document that should be coming out shortly as well. We'll do our best to follow up on all the questions that we weren't able to get to today during the live session. Of course, if there's anything Charity Village can do to assist you, please do get in touch with us. And I hope you all have a really fantastic day, and goodbye for now.